When we think of World War II, we imagine soldiers with rifles, tanks rolling across battlefields, bombers filling the skies. We think of weapons and firepower, of military might determining the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history. But some of the most decisive victories of the war were won by people who never fired a shot, who had no weapons at all except their courage, their intelligence, and their refusal to accept defeat. These unarmed warriors changed the course of World War II in ways that no army could have accomplished alone, and their stories reveal a different kind of warfare, one fought with wit, compassion, and an unbreakable human spirit. In the occupied cities and towns of Europe, forgers became some of the most valuable soldiers in the resistance. They worked in basements and attics, in hidden rooms behind bookshops and in the back rooms of churches, creating documents that could mean the difference between life and death. These men and women had no training in espionage or combat. They were artists, printers, clerks, and civil servants who understood paper, ink, stamps, and bureaucracy. They studied authentic German documents with obsessive attention to detail, noting the exact shade of ink used, the precise spacing of typewritten letters, the watermarks in official paper, the subtle variations in stamps and seals. They created false identity cards, travel permits, ration cards, and work papers so convincing that even Gestapo officers examining them closely could find no flaws. In the Netherlands alone, forgers produced tens of thousands of identity documents that allowed Jews to hide in plain sight, transforming them on paper from hunted victims into Dutch citizens with Christian names and spotless histories. These forgers risked immediate execution if discovered, yet they continued their work night after night, knowing that every document they created might save a life. Their weapons were pens and paper, their battlefield was the bureaucratic machinery of occupation, and their victories were measured in lives saved rather than enemies killed. Across occupied Europe, railway workers became saboteurs without ever touching a weapon or explosive. These men and women understood that modern warfare depended on logistics, on the movement of troops and supplies by rail. They knew every signal, every switch, every schedule. German military trains carrying tanks and troops to the Eastern Front mysteriously found themselves diverted onto sidings that led nowhere. Paperwork got lost or misfiled, causing critical delays. Trains that should have taken 2 days to reach their destinations took a week, arriving too late to effect the battles they were meant to reinforce. Railway workers in France, Belgium, Poland, and Italy created a network of deliberate inefficiency that the Germans could never quite identify or stop because it looked like ordinary bureaucratic confusion rather than sabotage. A switch operator who sent a supply train down the wrong track, a clerk who misrouted shipping orders, a dispatcher who created scheduling conflicts that caused delays. Each of these small acts multiplied across thousands of railway workers created massive disruptions. The German military complained constantly about transportation problems in occupied territories, never fully understanding that they were fighting an invisible enemy who controlled the rails. These railway workers never held guns, but they delayed reinforcements, disrupted supply lines, and contributed to German defeats on distant battlefields by ensuring that troops and equipment arrived too late or not at all. In hospitals and medical facilities across occupied Europe, doctors and nurses became resistance fighters through the simple act of healing. They treated wounded resistance members and Allied soldiers without reporting them to authorities, hiding them in hospital wards under false names or fake diagnoses. A wounded partisan became a patient recovering from appendicitis. An Allied pilot became a local man suffering from pneumonia. Doctors falsified medical records, nurses provided alibis, and entire hospital staffs conspired to protect those who would have been executed if discovered. In Denmark, when the Germans demanded that doctors provide information about Jewish patients for deportation, the medical community refused as one. Doctors warned their Jewish patients of the impending roundup, helped them escape, and then reported that they had been discharged or transferred. In Poland, doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto created fake typhus epidemics to keep German authorities away from certain areas, knowing the Germans feared infectious disease. These medical professionals understood that healing was itself an act of resistance, that preserving life in the face of a regime devoted to death was a form of warfare. Their weapons were their medical knowledge and their willingness to violate orders, and their victories were the patients who survived. Priests, ministers, and religious leaders across Europe turned their churches into fortresses of resistance without ever raising a weapon. They hid families in church attics and crypts, sheltered resistance fighters between services, and stored weapons and supplies beneath altars and behind religious icons. They provided false baptismal certificates that transformed Jewish children into Christians on paper, giving them new identities that could save them from deportation. Churches maintained their own underground networks, moving people from parish to parish, from monastery to convent, creating a spiritual underground railroad that stretched across occupied territories. In Rome, the Vatican and monasteries throughout the city hid thousands of Jews and escaped Allied prisoners during the German occupation. In France, Protestant villages in the mountains sheltered entire Jewish families for years. In Poland, priests risked execution to maintain their congregations and their faith under a regime that wanted to destroy both. These religious leaders had no weapons except their moral authority and their willingness to protect those who sought sanctuary. They understood that in a war against evil, remaining neutral was itself a sin, and they chose sides knowing the cost. Their churches became fortresses not of stone but of faith, and the lives they saved testified to a different kind of power than military might. Teachers across occupied Europe transformed education into resistance, teaching in secret when schools were closed or corrupted by Nazi ideology. In Poland, where the Germans tried to reduce the population to illiterate laborers, teachers organized underground schools, holding classes in basements and forests, teaching Polish history and literature that the occupiers had banned. Students attended these illegal classes knowing that discovery meant deportation to concentration camps for both students and teachers. Yet the underground education system grew to include thousands of students and teachers. In Norway, teachers refused to join the Nazi-controlled teachers' union or teach the Nazi curriculum, leading to the arrest of over 1,000 teachers. But they continued teaching through letters and secret meetings, maintaining Norwegian culture and identity against German efforts to destroy them. These teachers understood that occupying a country meant controlling not just its territory but its mind, and they fought back by preserving knowledge, culture, and the ability to think critically. Their classrooms were wherever students could gather in secret. Their textbooks were whatever materials they could hide and share. And their weapons were ideas, history, and the determination to keep minds free, even when bodies were imprisoned. Farmers and rural communities provided a different kind of resistance, one based on their control of food and their knowledge of the land. They hid escaped prisoners and resistance fighters in barns and fields, guided people through the countryside to safety, and provided food to those in hiding, despite German requisitions that were supposed to leave them barely enough to survive. When the Germans demanded livestock and crops, farmers hid animals in forests, underreported harvests, and claimed that yields were poor due to weather or disease. They fed resistance networks and underground communities, creating a parallel food supply that sustained those fighting the occupation. In Denmark, farmers helped transport Jews to the coast for evacuation to Sweden, hiding families in hay wagons and farm trucks. In France, farmers in remote areas sheltered Allied airmen for weeks or months, teaching them basic French and providing civilian clothes before passing them along escape networks. These rural resistors had no weapons, but they had land, food, and knowledge of terrain that made them invaluable. Their farms became safe houses, their fields became hiding places, and their harvests fed the resistance as well as their families. Librarians and archivists became guardians of culture and memory, hiding books that the Nazis wanted to burn, preserving records that documented crimes, and maintaining knowledge that occupiers wanted destroyed. In Poland, librarians smuggled books out of libraries before the Germans could burn them, hiding them in private homes and underground caches. In France, archivists concealed documents that proved ownership of property so that returning survivors could reclaim their homes. In the Netherlands, librarians provided false information to Germans searching for Jewish records while secretly warning potential victims. These guardians of knowledge understood that the Nazis were fighting not just a military war but a cultural one, attempting to erase entire peoples and their histories from existence. By preserving books, records, and documents, these librarians and archivists fought back against that erasure. Their libraries became resistance cells. Their archives became weapons against forgetting, and their work ensured that history and culture survived. Even children became part of the unarmed resistance, serving as couriers and lookouts because they aroused less suspicion than adults. Children carried messages hidden in schoolbooks, transported small weapons and supplies in lunch pails and backpacks, and watched for German patrols, warning resistance members when danger approached. In Warsaw, children smuggled food into the ghetto through sewers and gaps in the wall. In France, children delivered underground newspapers and guided escaped prisoners to safe houses. These children understood the risks they were taking, had seen what happened to those who were caught, yet they chose to help because they understood that doing nothing was also a choice. They had no weapons except their innocence, which made them less suspicious, and their courage, which made them willing to face dangers that adults tried to shield them from. Throughout occupied Europe, switchboard operators became intelligence gatherers, listening to German phone conversations and passing information to resistance networks. They connected German calls while memorizing troop numbers, movement orders, and strategic discussions. Postal workers intercepted and copied German correspondence, providing resistance movements with intelligence about planned operations and security measures. Telegraph operators sent messages that appeared routine but contained coded warnings and information. These communications workers understood that information was power, that knowing German plans in advance could save lives and enable successful resistance operations. They had access that soldiers and spies could never achieve, simply because they were part of the infrastructure that the occupation depended upon. Their weapons were their positions within the system, and their willingness to betray the trust placed in them by the occupiers. The impact of these unarmed resistors on the outcome of World War II cannot be measured in traditional military terms. They won no battles, destroyed no tanks, shot down no aircraft. Yet they saved tens of thousands of lives, disrupted German logistics and communications, preserved culture and knowledge, maintained morale among occupied populations, and provided intelligence that enabled military victories. They proved that warfare is not only about weapons and soldiers, that courage is not only displayed on battlefields, and that ordinary people with no military training or equipment can still fight back against tyranny and make a difference. These unarmed warriors remind us that resistance takes many forms, that everyone has something they can contribute to fighting injustice, and that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not guns and bombs but compassion, intelligence, defiance, and the refusal to cooperate with evil. They changed World War II not through violence but through thousands of small acts of courage and humanity that added up to something powerful enough to help bring down a regime built on violence and hatred. Their legacy is not measured in enemy casualties but in lives saved, in knowledge preserved, in hope maintained during the darkest years of human history.